Hi all, so today I would like to talk about the consuls in medieval communes. It's a very wide topic, as always. And say we can't cover, it all. I would like just to show in this video how the consular institution was created, essentially. There is nothing teleological in the creation of these figures, in these of these institutions, of course. But let's say that the communal phenomenon throughout the medieval age was often, regulated by similar dynamics, or at least, even if they were indeed quite different from each other, certain institutional figures come very often. Uh, and one of the consul is definitely one of them, and probably the most important, at least at the beginning of the communal society, essentially. And Today I was thinking about making this video, and I went checking, as I often do, before the video itself, to check for a good picture to put in background. Here I have placed the consular palace of Gubbio, that is a city in the center of Italy, that embodies the power of the consuls in that particular region of Europe during the Middle Ages. Um, However, by searching that, and I think it is rather fascinating, I noticed that in the English language on Google, basically the pictures about medieval consuls um, were practically non-existent. So I got curious and I went searching for, at least the English Wikipedia, and I've read substantially that there wasn't an example of there were several examples of consuls during the Middle Ages, but essentially they were all, quite exceptional figures within the various medieval institutions of these consuls, and there was not even a mention of the extremely important structural presence of consuls into the central and northern Italian communes. And this is absurd. There was, I think, just a hint to Genoa, where the consuls are named, and probably I haven't read the whole article, but it was pretty short, so the list was pretty clear. And I noticed overall, by googling and look at the results of consuls during the communal age, that there is an absence, a complete absence of this topic around the internet. And these are the things that really drive me crazy, because I cannot understand how such macroscopic institution, for numbers and spread and political relevance during the Middle Ages can be neglected, as if it didn't exist. This sadly reconfirms that there is a blind ignorance about medieval history in popular culture and mass culture, and people seem to like the Middle Ages just for, I don't know, the projections of their own national obsessions of empires and guys clashing one against another, and they don't even have heard what the communal consulship was about. And every medievalist knows what an immense part of medieval historiography is dedicated to the consular government in the chapter of the communes of communal institutions all over Europe. Um, so I think this is another good reason for talking about the consuls. And let's, however, give a look to what we mean by consul, because it's not that there was only one kind of consul during even the same communal age. The consul is a name that is was usually that was prevalently spread during the lower Middle Ages, especially in this context of, post 11th century rebirth, when cities gained political autonomy and began to create these institutions. But the name consul in Latin is something that you find during the whole Middle Ages, even the early one. And it's obviously a name of Roman origin, not just of Latin origin as a name, but obviously the consuls, as any of you probably know, were these collegial magistrates in ancient Rome that had essentially the full command of the army. There were two because it was such an important office that there was fear of abuses from these kind of magistrates, and part of the reason why, in fact, consuls in medieval communes are often appear as two as well, might be an indicator that not just there was, probably some good understanding of the Roman political system during the low Middle Ages, but also and especially that there were similar problems being met by these communities, and hence similar solutions to be found to cope with them. And during the consular age, the communal age, you find indeed that the consuls were so important to be the highest communal office, the highest magistrates, let's say, if this is a valid name. Actually, and this is so important in many ways that when you find consul being as a name in the sources for a city for the first time in its history, you can immediately understand that this is the moment in which that city had given to itself a communal organization. And in fact, within the same communal age, we talk about the consular era. We can say that was the first one, the one in which, in fact, the communes were created, and that makes you also understand how, very important, since the genetic moment of these political institutions, these figures were, and the consuls, as we will be seeing, would rule essentially the first half of communal history, especially in Italy, because this is what we're talking about. When we think about communes, we can't, be snobbish and saying, yeah, Italy is the most important country, but there were communes also elsewhere, indeed. But when we look at this specific office of consulship, we must say that in Italy this had its greatest and widest development, that it probably covered the highest, also the it represents, the preeminence of Italian city-states in all their complexity in many ways, while in other cities, in cities of other regions of Europe, the consuls were usually something different. Usually there were maybe one. It was more of a title than an actually functional role, even though it was still very important indeed. But it's important to see the root of this in the sense that the term consul in Latin is something that you find since the early medieval times, as I was saying before, because consul derives essentially from the term advising, and consuls were therefore people who belonged to the council, which has the same etymology. In both in Roman and medieval times, actually the consul had a markedly military role, and this is very important to remember because, as we have seen, in both periods, the consuls were entrusted the military power, with the only difference that in Roman times the consuls were essentially entrusted military power by the city. In medieval times things were a bit different because it was the same consuls in a way that created the city and the consular system in itself. So they had a power that went far beyond, in spite it was also obviously regulated by city by the city laws essentially. So how really did the consuls rise, at the head of communal society, and how communal society was born effectively through the consulship? Well, essentially, first of all, who were these consuls? These consuls were knights, milites, as we want to call them in Latin at that time. So they were guys who really pre-existed as a class, let's say, the same communal institutions as we've seen, and who belonged originally, especially from to the feudal system in many ways that had created them as a political military elite, and also as a social elite indeed. The birth of the communes is actually also very variegated, so we can't generalize. But let's say that usually the communes were born out of the cooperation of certain knights who had a certain power already in the society, the pre-existing society of the commune, who joined essentially into these communal enterprise the middle and small landowners who weren't nobles, but who were quite important for the development, especially the economical development of a communal institution, and who essentially got together to form that they would make a sworn oath, like most of medieval societies where political societies were created, or even maintained. It was a normal praxis, and however the relationship between these two groups, so essentially knights and commoners in many ways, was we can't say conflictual in many ways, in spite they were effectively cooperating for keeping this new political institution of the commune alive. Usually these relationships would be firstly influenced by the pre-existing relations that existed between the knights and the rest of society. So these levels of autonomies that the local population had from the local government organism, and there would be there was a dialectical relationship in the measure in which the commoners had in their own turn certain leaders that couldn't be equated to the knights from the other side, but who essentially led the the community in dialogue, whether pacific or violent, to the with the knights. And the interesting thing is that it usually happened that the two consuls that were created during this first age of communal history would be drawn, one from the commoners and one from the knight class, which is a clever thing because it was obviously something similar happened also in Rome, when one consul could be a plebeian and another a patrician, and this collegial office would obviously be of extreme importance for for keeping the balance between the two social groups, where we can call them. Um, and usually, however, and especially at the beginning of the consular age, it would be evident in many ways that although the knights couldn't make without the commoners, it was still them who ruled over the second. So the commune was created in order to, benefit collectively from it. But the knights had the preeminence over this system. First of all, because they were the ones who were more powerful. And they were more powerful, and this is an important, difference, especially with the Roman times, because these knights, as we've seen, were still usually part of a feudal aristocracy, or at least an aristocracy who owned a big deal of properties, who incidentally and sometimes didn't belong to the city. So the one of the most important parts of this is that knights weren't truly conceiving themselves as just part of the commune, but they would have their mind set on wider horizons, and this is a characteristics that the civic knights will essentially maintain throughout the world communal history, which is the idea that they could have one foot into the city and another into the countryside, and behaving as citizens in the city and as lords in the countryside. Or maybe not just as lords, in the sense that they were autonomous from that point of view, but that they would still keep relations with the feudal hierarchy, sometimes even with the highest ranks, with kings and emperors. And you can understand that this double face of the knights would create certain problems. And initially, this didn't, however, because the commoners were too weak to actually counter this consular power, and one of the knights, therefore. And they usually followed them into their enterprises. And in fact, a common mistake that we should avoid when thinking of communal history is that the communal world, the communal institution, wasn't actually born out of a middle class that sought, I don't know, to replicate democratic political system. On the contrary, the communes were quite evidently an aristocratic creation, that obviously, as we have seen, benefited from the help of the commoners, who in parts obviously had their own interests, active interests as well, but that essentially was dominated and directed initially by the consuls. And this was very important. Then communal society evolved in another direction, for which the militia, which what normally we call militia, the commoners' troops, like the infantrymen and such. But the term militia in Latin actually means the class of the milites, so the class of the knights. And the militia, in this sense, was opened eventually to a censitary system, meaning that it didn't matter if you originally belonged to a family of knights, which especially in certain areas like the one of Italy had not even been a great problem, because the Italian knights were largely rose from the low, like other European knights, but meaning that they weren't created knights by a functioning feudal system, but they would reach the knighthood for their own wealth, and without any particular superior sanction. But you could become a knight even having a certain census that equated normally to the one necessary in order to maintain a horse, and to train with it for war regularly, and obviously having an armor, a knight armor, so that you could become essentially a knight class, and even maybe a consul at that point. And it's very interesting because that tells you how really fluid initially communal society was, and how it evolved in this sense. Also, the commoners, the infantry, were supposed to be equipped for war. Obviously, in a very different way from knights. They weren't cavalrymen indeed. They were normal infantry, but at a certain point, especially in wealthier European cities, the commoners would have a substantially heavy equipment, even for infantry, and they would have their own times of military glory on battlefields. Even though we are largely talking about times in which knights were seen and rightfully as sort of an unstoppable force on the battlefield, and of course even a cold shower for them would happen, especially in the beginning of the 14th century. But let's say that the communal asset still reflected these the preeminence of the knights in this institution. So what else can we say about it? I would like to stress the complexity of these consular figures, and how if you want, how busy and engaged into in the local affairs these knights actually were. Up to now, I presented to you a situation for which I stressed the pre-eminence of these knights, but we shouldn't emphasize consequently a strict division, lower classes, upper knightly class, because even though this was true, and we have seen it for under a censoratory point of view, there were also vertical divisions into society. Meaning what? Meaning that knights would, for instance, be from different families, from different clans, and these clans were obviously warring with each other, were competing. They had to show, and especially in front of the communal society, their own wealth, their own power, and we have seen how basically these men owned by right the political power of the city. So it wasn't something that was done, exceptionally, as, I don't know, someone who wants to stand out like a dictator. No, because these guys were already in charge. So the first aim of them would be to enlarge their own power by taking out their own rival clans. And how do you do that? Because you know you have your own power, you have your own knights in the family, etc. But how useful it is to, for instance, engage into these competition, into these feuds that took place regularly in the city life. The same commoners. You see, especially in a city, you don't fight. There were many city battles at the time. You don't just fight. You can't simply fight on horseback. You know, medieval cities had very narrow streets, very few open spaces, namely the town square or something like that, and you couldn't maneuver with cavalry. So and very often these medieval cities would have many fortifications within the same city walls. A lot of houses were fortified. They had towers, even catapults and stuff. They were used like warehouses, also for weapons. So in order to pursue a successful political, you know, escalation, let's say, you necessarily had to have within the cities commoners fighting on your side. So infantrymen would maybe weren't good on foot as knights as well, because knights were capable of fighting in every condition, but would definitely had a substantial, really increased advantage at fighting as compact and thick formations within the city streets and blocking the ways and besieging other cities of rival clans, etc. So there was always, from a consular point of view, the need of having the support of the local communities within the city, which obliged these aristocrats to to form bonds even with people who were not in their social status, and especially who were quite often the first wealth producers in a certain sense, because consuls tended in the first phase of communal history to, and in part even later, to essentially go into other cities, districts, to make war and to lay waste and to rob essentially, and to fight maybe against other knights but in knightly fashion. However, these guys weren't just all about war. There were also people who were deeply engaged into the local economies. Actually, it was the same consular class that directed the major transformation in the economy of many areas of Europe. This happened in Italy, in France, in Germany. I will be talking about that sooner or later because it's very important. But the real importance of these men was in fact the way they were able to move all these resources for the same commune, so for what they thought it was, their own business essentially. So they weren't just about war, but were also largely about economy, and this needed for them to be tied to the rest of society. The decline of the consulship and of the consular regimes was when the commoners began to be increasingly wealthy and numerous, and they would even become to start challenging the same military primate of the knights. And at a certain point, especially, and this happened more sharply into Italian city-states, there would be a time in which the commoners at a certain point would be able even to kick out the militia out of the city. obviously this didn't mean, I mean, at that point the people, as it was called, the block of the commoners, would have a militia on their own. As we have seen, the census at that time allowed even commoners to become knights, if not by by nobility, but by fact, essentially. So they would fight and leave like the other nobles. But it wasn't a very brilliant choice, because very often the people at that point was pretty wealthy but very divided most of the times, while and they would fall prey of the lords. And this is, by the way, in a nutshell, how the Italian lordships eventually rose, for instance. So the expulsion of the consuls would bring definitely to it was definitely a mistake in many ways, because these guys, in spite, they were kind of mobsters in the way they lived. They had a very feudal mind, essentially. This idea that the public thing was essentially a private thing, something that comes straight from Carolingian Europe. However, we're still men who knew what had to be done to keep the political and military power of the commune. Who were used to think and especially to project their mind outside the city walls, as we've seen, because most of their proprietaries were outside the city walls, while a commoner might take a lance and spear to kick out the knights out of the city, but he wouldn't know what to do with the political power gained. And much of this attrition actually between the militia class and the commoner and the people was created by the fact that the militia wanted to wage war constantly, regularly, as they were used to do as knights. And the citizens, imagined them as being artisans or other essentially civilian people who led a civilian life. All they cared about was, being free to do what they wanted, not to pay for these enormous military costs for which they had to contribute sensibly. And especially they didn't want to go after the knights during the military expeditions to which they were called, because they had, to plow their land, to make their business going on. And they never wanted to war, because they weren't war people, they weren't warriors, were essentially guys, drawn to war every once in a while without any training, and just to make mass and to help the knights collecting the booty and stuff like that. So the knights wouldn't trust these guys, because they said, and we can read that into chronicles, these people do not want to make war. They are a useless load in many ways. They're supposed to help us for the good of the commune, and instead all they want to do is, when they go to war, is to come home as soon as possible, while we would like to enjoy very prolonged raids over the enemies, and etc. So I think I went a bit astray from the original purpose of telling how the consular system worked, and how it was born. I could add other things, boring things, telling you how the various relationship between minor and major aristocracy, and seigneurial rights, etc. But I think I will leave this on another lesson on the communes. For now, I was interested to tell you how these consuls really came into play, and what class they represented, and the importance that they had within the communal institution, at least in the beginning. And as always, if you liked this video, I would very thankful to you if you could share it, or leave a like, or subscribe to my channel to receive further contents from it. And of course, if you have any question, please comment or send me an email. I thank you very, very much for listening to me. And as always, I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.